And so in terms of who you were formerly the Vice President of Global Talent Development and Learning at State Street. You were there for, over 8 years. You've had experience in a number of organizations, including Thomson Reuters. You are so passionate about learning and development and talent, and I'm so delighted to have you here for really it's an interview, but I would almost say it's more of a conversation to talk about one of your key passion areas and something that we're really interested in exploring. So that was a bit of a long introduction, but how are you doing?
I'm good, Temi. Thank you so much for having me here with you. I really appreciate it. And you're right, I'm incredibly passionate, not just about learning and talent development, but also about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And one of the reasons I'm so passionate about that is that I really feel like when we come together, that is how we grow together, and that's how we make our organizations grow. So it is, I sort of look at them as inextricably linked, and we can't possibly pry them apart, nor would we want to.
No, I appreciate that. And I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on to explore this conversation, because you recently, facilitated a session at one of our events, which we absolutely loved. And I really want to dive in terms of what belonging means to you, because we hear it a lot. We hear it as a strategic priority for an organization, but what does it mean to you?
Yeah. So, it's funny, the term belonging is sort of relatively new in corporate spaces, right? It's been a term that we've used since we were wee little tots, right? In terms of belonging. But what does that really mean? So, for years we talked about diversity and inclusion. And the word inclusion was really meant to say, everyone belongs here. And so I think one of the reasons why belonging is now being talked about specifically is that belonging is what we're aiming for with our inclusion efforts. But, when you are making an effort to include, right, that is something that you are doing strategically and tactically. But how do you know you've really had success with that? And that's where the belonging piece comes in. Very much like allyship should never be something that we go, I'm an ally, I name myself an ally. You are an ally when somebody says you are an ally, when somebody bestows that on you. And that's when you are identified as an ally. And I think belonging, there's that similarity in that we belong when we feel we belong. Right. And so our inclusion efforts in corporate spaces are meant to drive a feeling of belonging, but without the outcome of inclusion that works, that's successful, we don't get to a place where people feel that no matter who they are, where they are, how they got there, that they belong in the organization. And I think that's really where we harness the full power of diversity, because diversity just means that differences, right? That we have lots of different differences, and they may be visible, they may be invisible, but it's not just a collection of differences that create inclusion and that create belonging. Those are different sort of levers that we need to pull, actions we need to take, plans we need to make, feelings we need to cultivate in our workforce. And so when people do feel a sense of belonging, I think that's really the measure of success of those efforts of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I would love to explore, your journey to creating a culture of belonging, in the organizations that you work for. Like, what did it look like? How did you go about creating it? What were some of the obstacles that you faced?
Well, I think one of the very first things that, that I did on my journey, but also that I think others who are successful are doing, is that they stop looking at diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as like a problem that they're trying to solve, right? Because it really isn't. It really is a way of supercharging all of the other things you're doing in your organization to be successful towards the greater goals that your organization has, by making sure that you have access to the best talent, whoever they are, wherever they are, and that they can bring their whole selves to work and feel included, feel like they belong, and therefore perform. And that's one of the things too, is that we know statistically that, we can get into that later if you'd like, but we know statistically that when people feel that they belong in an organization, there is a bump in productivity, there is a bump in success. We know that diverse organizations have better decision making, and we know that they outperform other organizations. So that's the reason why we do it. But then the how that we do it, part of it is that we don't look at it as a problem. We look at it as a mechanism to increasing our success. And one of the ways we do that is that we really open up in ways that are conscious and unconscious our vision for what a successful workforce looks like, sounds like, is like. What I mean by that is a lot of organizations focus their diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts on things that are visible. But humans have so many more markers of diversity that are invisible than the ones that are visible. And so when we only focus on visible characteristics, which, by the way, are not always so visible, we think about things like race, and we think about gender, and we think about, visual signs of religious diversity, for example, but not all of those things are visible. And they often require somebody to make a judgment call, and humans are often wrong when we look at something. And so if we're just thinking about what we can see, we're missing out on all of the strengths that we have from different individuals. So things like neurodiversity, things like learning disabilities, things like language that you may not necessarily know that someone is fluent in many languages. That could be a superpower that your organization could harness. So diversity of experience, diversity of origin, diversity of kind of identity. These are all different ways in which we can harness the strengths that our people bring to work. And so I think the first thing organizations need to do is dig deeper than race, gender, and geography. If that's all you're focusing on as an organization, there's just so much more you could invite people to bring to the table at work. And you are going to see that when people feel comfortable bringing their whole selves to work and feel comfortable taking a risk to say, hey, I have this idea. I know that we haven't done it this way before, but if we do X, Y, Z, I mean, that's where we see huge time savers coming from. That's where we see innovation. That's where we see getting out of the rut. That in many ways, we have organizations that have these ruts they're in and it's not working. And every year they try and make it work a little better, and they just fall further and further behind. And so DEIB, as we sometimes call it, can be a real partner, a function within companies in order to achieve their strategic global goals.
So what would you say to sort of CLO or the head of talent or, an executive that's focused in on DEI who says, I get what you're saying, I completely agree, I see the impact, I see the power, I want to create this culture of belonging. How do I do it successfully? Not just how do I just do it, but how do I do it and really do it really well? Like, what would you say to that person?
I would say, first of all, pretty parties are fun, but pretty parties don't move the needle in terms of business goals. So really what we need to do is we need to align our goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging to our goals around the business. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to open new markets? Are we trying to, increase customer retention and client retention? Are we trying to increase engagement within the organization? What are those goals that an organization has identified to do better, to succeed at the levels they'd like to succeed this year and then the next? And then I think, one of the things we have to look at is what are some of those barriers to the success, right? And where is unconscious bias playing a role? Where is the assumption that a market doesn't exist playing a role? Sometimes due to unconscious bias. And one of the things we're seeing now too is with the increase in the use of AI-backed tools, what checks and balances do we have to make sure that we're not getting, faster, but not better with things? So, are we checking any unconscious bias that our AI tools have? Because our AI tools were created by humans, and humans do have unconscious bias. It's how our brains learn. and it can be harnessed for good and it can be harnessed for not good. And so that's something that we need to be really consciously aware of. But I think, you know, the saying, what gets measured gets managed, is very, very true. And so if we want to have our DEIB goals really impact the bottom line in an organization or the future growth in an organization, we have to identify how having you know, the best talent at the table, having the best talent coming into our organizations, having a much broader customer base, having maybe a larger global footprint, all of those things can fit in with our DEIB structure and goals. And how does that then fit in with what we're trying to achieve as a company? And sometimes it's a matter of not losing our best talent. Because if our best talent feels like they don't have a place at the company, or feels like the company doesn't align with their personal values, they will leave, because there are plenty of companies out there. And people can also tell the difference between DEIB efforts that happen certain months of the year because it's popular and all the kids are doing it, right? And so it's great. That's a great starting place. But if that is the only place that an organization is getting to, very, very quickly, both the employees and the clients will figure out that they're not serious about this thing that is really, really critical to be successful in the world today and in the world tomorrow.
Mm. And, you know, the next question I have for you is, you know, what role do leaders play in all of this? Because if you're talking about business goals, that starts from leadership. So, you know, when you're talking about DIB goals, are the leaders the ones sort of making it happen in terms of setting those goals too? Do we need them to endorse them and create them? What role do leaders play in creating these goals?
Leaders are critical in this, because leaders, as the title implies, lead the way, right? And so one of the things that's really, really important that people need to understand, that leaders need to understand, is that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know everything about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. In fact, I've worked with some leaders over the years who it was their vulnerability and telling the story of their aha moment, right? Like where they used to really think about something incorrectly and then they learned. And that has been something that has made a huge, huge difference in organizations. It is a game changer, because then what the leader is doing is for other people in the organization who have also had that experience of like thinking that they outgrew and growing into new thinking that opened up their minds to be successful in new ways they never knew were possible, they can look to their leader and say, you know, I can grow, I can learn, I can move this business beyond where we are today. And so I think one of the things that holds leaders back, I think there are two really big things. The first one is they just don't know there's a problem. And it may be because they are not the person who's affected by it. So I think of it this way, right? Like if you are not the person who is going to be affected by bias or discrimination or something along those lines related to diversity and inclusion or equity, you're not going to see it through the windshield of your car going forward. However, you may very well be able to see it in the rear view mirror after this thing has happened. And one of the ways that you can sometimes see it is that somebody speaks to you about it and speaks to you about their experience. So that's the other thing too that I've seen in organizations, is that when the leaders are listening to the real lived experiences of their employees or of other people like their employees, it then sensitizes them in a way, you know, that they then are seeing things and hearing things that they didn't see or hear before. And you know, that is something that like it starts to change us. And once we become changed, it's really hard to go back to the point where you don't see it anymore. I think about the optical illusion of it. Is it a vase or is it two faces? Right. So if you look at it and you think it's a vase, you don't see the two faces. And when somebody points that out, then all of a sudden you can't unsee the faces. You might be able to pick out the vase again, but you can't go back to the place where you didn't know that there were two lived realities in that picture.
And I'd love to know from your experience, working in an organization, what initiatives or practices were implemented to make you feel like you really belong there? Like what stood out to you in like you look at your career?
Yeah, I think, it's been really powerful when there are aspects of my identity that then are mentioned, right? It has been really powerful. I think that this is not an example that is, unfamiliar to many people, certainly not to women listening to this. But I have been in meetings where I've suggested something, and then the next, the conversation goes on. And then a man in the meeting suggests the exact same thing I suggested a few minutes ago. And everybody says, "Oh, Bob, what a great idea." And I'm like, hello, I had that idea like 3 minutes ago, right? And I know that you're laughing because we have all kind of experienced this. And so it's been great in meetings where this happens. And I am not suggesting that, Bob in my example had any kind of, purposeful bias or animus or was trying to take credit for the idea. It's just that we sometimes don't hear specific voices in the conversation. And so if you are somebody who hears the voices that are not getting heard, you have that opportunity to amplify. So I have worked with, with leaders who have said, "Oh, hey, Bob, that's great. I love that you love the idea that Alison mentioned not that long ago. Let's talk about that idea since it seems like it's very popular," right? Like you don't have to shame somebody who's done it, but what you can do is you can make sure that people are able to talk. And even further, if you're getting talked over in a meeting, it's nice to have people in the meeting, and it doesn't have to follow along gender lines, right? It doesn't have to follow along racial lines. Sometimes it's the people on the phone and everybody else is in person. How are we making sure the people on the comms line are also getting their voice heard? And so there's an aspect of this of just being like a good citizen, right? And being a good person. But I think one of the key things that we can do is we can listen for the voices that are not getting heard, and we can help amplify them. And then we should also look around in our meetings, in our decision making, and try and think about who's not being included, whose voices are not being heard. And then let's check our assumptions, because I have seen throughout my career time savings, effort savings, all sorts of things when we talk to stakeholders we didn't realize were stakeholders. I was with a company once where we were about to, launch this whole new program. And by going around and doing some like information gathering, we discovered that program was already working in another country, but that other country really just didn't have a seat at the table in terms of being able to say, "Hey, we're doing this." Now, it's not that the information wasn't shared somewhere, but there wasn't a global awareness of what was a very, very well run program. And I think we see that in big companies, especially global companies, all the time. When you've got like sort of the head offices and then some of the satellite offices, that's a great opportunity to bring in, diverse voices. Well, those are geographically diverse voices. It doesn't have to be about gender. It doesn't have to be about race. It doesn't have to be about orientation. Like wherever we have voices that are not being heard, let's try and find them. And then let's listen. And then let's figure out how we can bring, people together. There's this quote, "If I've gone further than other," I'll say people, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants, right? Like, and I'm not saying who said it because I can't remember, but I think that's true. Like if we can work together to harness all the good ideas, right? And really not make it a competition, but the competition really should be for our company and our organization to succeed. And the best way for us to do that is to make sure we're pulling from, lots of different pools. That doesn't mean it's chaos. It doesn't mean everybody gets an equal vote all the time, right? But it does mean that we listen, and it does mean that we set up appropriate channels for information so that we can save ourselves the time and trouble of not pursuing things that some part of the organization already knows won't work.
I feel like empathy is the most underrated skill, but the most valuable skill, or is it a skill? I don't even know, I just think it's so valuable, because everything you're saying that I'm hearing, I find that underneath it all, it's just the ability to be empathetic and just to be able to understand somebody else's perspective and really see things through their eyes, but which is not an easy thing for everyone. But I think fundamentally, if we, and of course, you know, how do we develop that capability or that skill or whatever, however you want to label it? But it just seems to me at the heart of everything that we're saying is how do we just lead with empathy?
You know, I think empathy is a really great call out, because like empathy, like many things, can be good for used for good or evil, right? So Kim Scott does a lot of really neat things around the concept of empathy within Radical Candor, because sometimes, you know, people have what we call ruinous empathy, right? So for example, you have somebody who has just come back from maternity leave, has a new baby, and the assumption is made that she doesn't want to travel. So she's not included in the new big deal that's happening because, oh, you just had a baby, you don't want to travel, right? And so that's ruinous empathy. Like that's empathizing without actually allowing the person that you're trying to empathize with to have a voice and to have power over, you know, their own feelings and thoughts. And so I think that's a negative, but I think you're right about empathy being that we, you know, we don't have to have the same lived experience of someone else in order to begin to open up our minds to try to understand what that might be like. But I think empathy, like many other things, one of the best things we can do is kind of check our assumptions around it, you know, and I had a role once where I was on the road all the time. And I actually had a baby on the road with me, and nobody in the company knew that my daughter was on the road with me for months, because it was easier for me in my life at the time to bring her with me, and rather than leaving her at home. And it allowed me to do my job. And months later, I mentioned something about it, and my colleagues were like, "What? How have you been doing this?" And I was like, "Lots of planning." So I think it's good for us to remember that that empathizing means opening ourselves up and listening, but it doesn't mean that we then decide for somebody based on our impression of what they might feel, or based on our own feelings. Like, you know, if I were in this situation, I would feel this, and then we go to town on what we think we would feel.
No, I get that. I think that you're saying it's like understanding other people's perspective, but then not making the assumptions. The assumptions
Yeah.
part is the bit that can be really dangerous. I feel like,
Yeah. And something as simple as just being like, you know, hey, we have this trip coming up, and, you know, I would love to have you there, but, you know, how do you feel about that? Would you feel like that is the right way you want to participate, or is there another way you want to participate? I'm open to whatever you think is the right thing for you right now.
yeah, no, I agree. I agree. Just checking in and seeing how they feel about the, you know, whatever it is that you're suggesting, just so that they feel included, again, included in the decision-making process. Um, Thank you so much, Alison. Is there anything, you know, as we round up, is there anything that you want to say, some final words? You know, our community, we have global heads of learning, we have chief talent officers, we have a real mix of people that are part of our community. Is there anything you'd like to say, you know, people who are wanting to really develop this and really create this culture in the organization? Maybe one tip that you would say that really helped you, you know, on your journey?
Yeah. I think the big thing that I would say is don't be afraid of making mistakes, because we all make mistakes. And even, you know, even people who identify as being part of a, you know, a diverse group can easily make mistakes even within their own community, or in, you know, other diverse communities. And so when you make a mistake, just own it, apologize, and, you know, you can often move on from there, right? But the biggest thing too is that whatever community we are learning about, right? Because diversity is so broad and so wide, there's always stuff that we don't know. And there are always things changing. And, you know, in some of the communities I'm a part of, the language has changed over the course of my corporate career of what we, you know, what language we use to talk about ourselves, right? And so I think really the big thing is don't be afraid to be a work in progress, because we all are. And if you are somebody who is working alongside somebody who is a work in progress and they are messing up, and maybe they're messing up in a way that's offensive, we can be kind and clear at the same time and privately set somebody straight about, like what not to say if it is offensive, or just let them know. But it doesn't mean that people are a bad person, or it doesn't mean that they're, that they are biased if they use the wrong language. We have to give people grace and help them along the way. And if we are the person who needs help along the way, we can't turn everyone else into our teachers. We have the work that we have to do ourselves. But at the same time, we just need to be humble and vulnerable as we learn things together, because one thing we know to be true is that there's always something new to learn at every corner. And that is the joy and beauty of life.
Always something to learn. Just be curious. But certainly life is just about learning, isn't it? Well, thank you, Alison. I appreciate you taking the time to come and share some of your wisdoms and your nuggets. And thank you. I really do appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you at a future session.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me. It was great to be here with you today.